Ever heard of a 6-inch piece of wire changing the course of a war? It sounds crazy, right? But this is the story of how one mechanic, armed with nothing more than a snippet of piano wire and a refusal to accept the status quo, saved the lives of nearly 100 American pilots and transformed one of World War II's most iconic fighters. Our story begins in the suffocating heat of August 17, 1943, at WWII Airfield in New Guinea. The air is thick with humidity and the smell of aviation fuel. Here, Technical Sergeant James McKennick, an aircraft mechanic with the 5th Air Force, is watching a young pilot suit up. The pilot is about to climb into the cockpit of a P-38 Lightning, a beast of an aircraft. With its twin booms, twin engines, and a devastating concentration of firepower in its nose, the P-38 was a fearsome weapon. It was fast, it could climb like a rocket, and it could take a beating. On paper, it was a world beater. But McKenna knew its fatal secret. He watched the pilot settle into the cockpit, a mix of confidence and apprehension on his face. This pilot, and many others like him, were going up against the legendary Japanese Mitsubishi A6M, better known as the Zero. The Zero was the undisputed king of the dogfight. It was incredibly agile, a featherweight dancer in the sky that could turn on a dime. And the P-38, for all its power and speed, couldn't keep up in a turning fight. McKenna had seen it happen too many times. A P-38 would get into a turning battle with a Zero, and it would end in a fireball plunging into the dense jungle below. The problem wasn't a lack of power or a flaw in the P-38's design. It was something much smaller, something almost invisible, yet utterly deadly. It was slack. Slack in the control cables. Imagine trying to steer a car with a loose steering wheel. You turn the wheel, but there's a moment of nothingness before the car starts to respond. Now, imagine that delay in the middle of a life-or-death dogfight at 300 miles per hour. That's exactly what P-38 pilots were facing. When a pilot yanked the control stick to bank or pull up, there was a 3/8 inch delay before the ailerons or elevators actually moved. 3/8 of an inch. It doesn't sound like much, does it? But in the split-second world of aerial combat, where a Zero could be on your tail in the blink of an eye, 3/8 of an inch was an eternity. It was the difference between getting a shot off and taking one. It was the difference between coming home and becoming another statistic. This tiny delay was killing pilots. McKenna knew it. The pilots knew it. They could feel it every time they flew. They'd complain about the controls feeling mushy or unresponsive. They were fighting not just the enemy, but their own aircraft. Every maneuver was a gamble, a desperate attempt to compensate for that built-in lag. The frustration was palpable on the airbase. These were some of the best pilots in the world, flying one of the most advanced fighters. And they were being systematically taken apart by a lighter, more agile opponent because of a seemingly minor mechanical issue. So, what was the official word on this deadly problem? Well, according to every training manual and every engineering officer, there was no problem. The cable tension was within specifications. The slack was deemed an acceptable tolerance. Think about that. Acceptable tolerance. Acceptable to whom? To the engineers in a comfortable office thousands of miles away, certainly wasn't acceptable to the pilots who were paying for that tolerance with their lives. For McKenna, this wasn't just a technical issue. It was personal. He was the one who serviced these planes. He was the one who looked these young pilots in the eye before they took off. And he was the one who had to see the empty bunks when they didn't come back. The official explanation was an insult to their memory. Acceptable tolerance was a bureaucratic death sentence, and James McKenna was done accepting it. He knew that if the rulebook was the problem, he'd have to throw the rulebook away. He'd talked to the pilots. He'd felt the slack in the controls himself on the ground. He understood the physics of what was happening. When a pilot pulled back on the stick, the slack had to be taken up before the cable could pull on the control surface. This wasted precious time and energy. It made the plane feel sluggish and unresponsive right when the pilot needed it to be an extension of his own body. While the top brass dismissed the issue, McKenna became obsessed. He spent his off hours in the maintenance hangars, studying the P-38's control systems. He traced the long runs of cable from the cockpit to the tail and the wings. He tinkered, he measured, he thought. He knew there had to be a way to eliminate that slack without redesigning the entire system. He was just a technical sergeant, not a high-ranking engineer. He didn't have the authority to order major modifications. Whatever he did, it had to be simple, effective, and, most importantly, something he could do himself without anyone noticing. Night after night, surrounded by the metallic scent of oil and the quiet hum of the jungle insects, McKenna brainstormed. He needed something to take up that slack automatically, to keep the cables taut at all times. Springs, too complex, too prone to failure. Adjusting the turnbuckles, that would only work on the ground. In the air, as the metal frame of the aircraft expanded and contracted with temperature changes, the slack would just come back. He needed something elegant, something simple. Something that would work with the existing system, not against it. And then he found his answer in the most unlikely of places. It wasn't in an engineering manual or a technical diagram. It was an idea born from pure, practical, hands-on mechanical intuition. An idea so simple, so unorthodox, that his superiors would have called it stupid. Dangerous, even. But McKenna wasn't trying to win a design award. He was trying to save lives, and he had a plan. A plan that involved a 6-inch piece of piano wire. This simple wire, a material known more for making music than for winning wars, was about to become the key to unlocking the P-38's true potential. McKenna believed his stupid little trick could make the Lightning outmaneuver a zero. He was about to put his career, and potentially his freedom, on the line to prove it. He found a pilot, a willing volunteer who trusted the seasoned mechanic more than the official manuals. The plan was set. Under the cover of darkness, McKenna performed his unauthorized modification on one of the P-38s. It was a stealth operation, a quiet rebellion against a deadly bureaucracy. He carefully installed his device, a piece of wire configured in a way that no engineer had ever considered. It was a clever, almost elegant solution to a problem that had stumped the experts. He checked his work, then checked it again. It was perfect. The mushiness in the controls was gone. On the ground, at least, the stick felt connected, responsive, alive. The next morning, the pilot took off on a test flight. McKenna watched from the ground, his heart pounding in his chest. Was this going to work? Or had he just made things worse? Had he just sent a man up in a dangerously modified aircraft? The minutes stretched into an eternity. He scanned the skies, waiting. Finally, the P-38 reappeared, but it wasn't just flying back. It was putting on a show. The pilot was throwing the big fighter around the sky like it was a lightweight aerobatic plane. The rolls were crisper, the turns were tighter. The plane looked different. It looked alive. When the P-38 landed, the pilot jumped out of the cockpit, his face beaming. He ran over to McKenna, shouting over the noise of the idling engines. "Mac, I don't know what you did," he yelled, "but I can fight with this thing now. I can turn with a zero." It was the moment of truth. McKenna's crazy idea had worked. He had fixed the P-38. But this was just one plane, and his secret was about to cause a whole lot of trouble. His unauthorized modification had been a success. But what would happen when the high command found out? A technical sergeant rewriting the book on aircraft engineering wasn't something the Army took kindly to. The story of McKenna's wire was just beginning. It would lead to a confrontation with his superiors, a high-stakes demonstration for a skeptical general, and ultimately, a change that would ripple throughout the entire Pacific Theater. What exactly was this piano wire trick? And how did one enlisted man manage to out-engine the entire United States Army, Air Forces? August 17, 1943. Dobodura Airfield, New Guinea. Technical Sergeant James McKenna An aircraft mechanic with the 5th Air Force is watching another pilot get ready for a mission. The pilot is climbing into the cockpit of a P-38 Lightning, one of the most advanced fighters of its time. It's fast, heavily armed, and has an incredible range. But it has a fatal flaw, a secret weakness that Japanese Zero pilots know how to exploit. The P-38 just can't turn with a zero. In a dogfight, that inability to turn is a death sentence. McKenna knows why. He's felt it on the ground, sitting in the cockpit, wiggling the control stick. There's a slight delay, a tiny but noticeable slack before the control surfaces, the ailerons, actually move. He measured it. It was 3/8 of an inch. A 3/8 inch delay between when a pilot moved the stick and when the plane began to respond. In the heat of combat, where decisions are made in fractions of a second, 3/8 of an inch was an eternity. It was the difference between getting a kill and getting killed. The problem was maddeningly simple: slack in the control cables. These long steel wires ran from the cockpit all the way to the ailerons on the wings. Temperature changes, humidity, and the stresses of flight could cause them to stretch and sag, creating that deadly delay. McKenna saw pilots dying, and he knew this was the reason. He brought it up with his superiors, the engineering officers. They checked the manuals. The cable tension was within specifications. 'Twas, they said, an acceptable tolerance. For the pilots flying into combat, it was anything but acceptable. It was a killer. McKenna couldn't let it go. He watched as another P-38, flown by a young, confident pilot, roared down the runway and lifted into the humid New Guinea sky. Heading towards a confrontation with Zeros, McKenna knew the pilot's life depended on outmaneuvering an enemy that was famous for its agility. And he knew that the acceptable tolerance in his plane's controls put him at a severe disadvantage. The engineers wouldn't listen. The manuals were clear. Officially, there was no problem to solve. But McKenna was a mechanic, a problem solver. And as he watched that plane disappear into the clouds, he decided that if the brass wouldn't fix it, he would. His solution was ingenious, simple, and completely unauthorized. It was a stupid little trick that would go on to change the course of the air war in the Pacific. What did he do? He found a way to add tension back into the system to eliminate that fatal slack. He went scrounging for parts, not in the official supply depots, but in the scrap heaps and workshops around the base. What he was looking for was a specific kind of metal. Something strong, flexible, and springy. He found it in an unlikely place: a broken-down piano. Kay took a piece of high-tensile piano wire. Back in the maintenance hangar, under the cover of night, McKenna started his secret project. He couldn't just tighten the main control cables. That would violate regulations and be immediately obvious. He had to be clever. He looked at the aileron boost tab system. This was a smaller secondary control surface on the aileron itself, designed to make the plane easier to handle at high speeds. Its cables were smaller and more accessible. This was his opening. He fabricated a small spring, about 6 inches long, out of the piano wire. He carefully shaped it into a coil. Then he devised a simple bracket to attach it. His idea was to install this spring into the boost tab's control system. The spring would pull constantly on the cables, keeping them taut and removing any slack. It wouldn't interfere with the pilot's control inputs. It would just make the system instantly responsive. There would be no more delay. The stick and the ailerons would move as one. The first installation was nerve-wracking. This was an unauthorized modification to a multi-million-dollar war machine. If he was caught, he could face a court-martial. If his modification failed, it could cause a crash, killing a pilot. But the risk of doing nothing was greater. He installed his spring on a P-38 that was undergoing routine maintenance. He hid it carefully, making it look like a standard part. The next morning, a pilot took that plane up for a test flight. When the pilot landed, he was ecstatic. He ran over to McKenna and the ground crew, a huge grin on his face. "I don't know what you guys did," he shouted over the engine noise, "but this plane has never flown better. It turns on a dime." The difference was night and day. The sluggishness was gone. The plane felt alive, responsive. It felt like it could finally take on a zero and win. Word spread like wildfire among the pilots. Suddenly, every P-38 pilot wanted the McKenna magic on their plane. Pilots started specifically requesting McKenna's maintenance crew. They would come to him, almost in secret, asking for the fix. McKenna and his team worked tirelessly, often at night, installing their homemade springs on as many P-38s as they could. They never asked for permission, they just did it. The results in the air were immediate and dramatic. P-38 kill ratios against the zero began to climb. American pilots were not only surviving encounters, they were dominating them. They could now turn inside the zeros, using their P-38's superior speed and firepower to full effect. One of the pilots who benefited from this modification was America's future top ace of all time, Major Richard Bong. Before the fix, Bong, like many others, found the P-38's roll rate frustratingly slow. After McKenna's spring was installed, the plane was transformed. Bong would go on to score 40 confirmed aerial victories, all of them flying the P-38. He and other aces like Thomas Maguire, who scored 38 victories, were flying planes that had been secretly and illegally modified by a lone technical sergeant with a piece of piano wire. Eventually, the top brass started noticing. The P-38s of the 5th Air Force were suddenly performing far better than those in any other theater of war. The kill ratios were so skewed that it couldn't be a coincidence. High-ranking engineering officers and representatives from Lockheed, the manufacturer, were sent to New Guinea to investigate. They were stumped. They interviewed the pilots, who were cagey, not wanting to get their favorite mechanic in trouble. They inspected the planes, but the small hidden spring was easily missed by anyone who wasn't looking for it. The secret couldn't last forever, though. One day, a visiting engineering officer was inspecting a P-38's control system with a fine-toothed comb when he spotted it. A strange, non-standard spring attached to the aileron booster tab cables. It was McKenna's piano wire fix. The officer was furious. This was a major breach of protocol. He immediately grounded the entire squadron and summoned Sergeant McKenna. He demanded an explanation for this unauthorized and dangerous modification. McKenna stood before the Board of Inquiry, expecting the worst. He calmly explained the problem of the cable slack, the acceptable tolerance that was getting pilots killed, and how his simple spring solved the problem. He explained that he had done it to save lives. The pilots, hearing that McKenna was in trouble, rallied to his defense. One after another, they testified how the modification had transformed the aircraft, how it made the difference between life and death in a dogfight. Ace pilots, squadron leaders, they all backed him up. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the passionate testimony of his pilots, the board had a choice. They could court-martial a sergeant for breaking the rules, or they could acknowledge that he had solved a problem that had stumped the aircraft's own designers. Lockheed engineers took a close look at McKenna's device. They were stunned. It was so simple, yet so effective. It was, they had to admit, brilliant. Instead of a court-martialed technical sergeant, James McKenna received the Legion of Merit, a prestigious military award for exceptionally meritorious conduct. His simple piano wire spring was officially incorporated by Lockheed as a standard modification kit. It was retrofitted to every P-38. Lightning in the Pacific Theater and included in all new P-38s coming off the assembly line. The McKenna spring became an official part. Historians estimate that this single 6-inch piece of wire, born from the frustration and ingenuity of one mechanic, saved the lives of between 80 and 100 American pilots. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest innovations come from boardrooms or design centers. They come from the people on the front lines, the ones who see a problem up close and are determined to find a solution, even if it means breaking a few rules. James McKenna wasn't an engineer or a test pilot. He was a mechanic who cared about his pilots. and his legacy is written in the skies of the Pacific War.
August 17, 1943, Dobodura Airfield, New Guinea. Technical Sergeant James McKenna watched another P-38 Lightning prepare for takeoff. A young pilot, barely out of his teens, was climbing into the cockpit, ready to face the deadliest fighter in the Pacific, the Japanese Zero, McKenna. A seasoned aircraft mechanic with the 5th Air Force felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach. He knew the P-38 was a beast fast, heavily armed, a true marvel of engineering. But it had a fatal flaw, a secret weakness that was sending American pilots to their graves. The P-38 couldn't turn with a zero in the lethal ballet of a dogfight, where a split second meant the difference between life and death. The Lightning was clumsy. Pilots would yank the stick, trying to get on a Zero's tail or evade its cannons, but there was a delay, a tiny, almost imperceptible lag between their input and the plane's response. McKenna had measured it himself, 3/8 of an inch of slack in the control cables. That tiny gap, that momentary hesitation, was a death sentence. He had brought it up with the engineering officers, showed them the slack in the aileron cables. They dismissed him. The cable tension was within specifications. They said it was acceptable tolerance according to the manuals written thousands of miles away by people who had never seen a Zero up close. But McKenna had seen the results of that acceptable tolerance. He'd seen the bullet-riddled planes that limped back to base, and he'd mourned the ones that never returned at all. The official line was that the P-38 was a boom and zoom fighter. It was supposed to dive on the enemy fire and use its superior speed to climb away. It was never meant to get into a turning fight with the nimble Zero, but war isn't fought by the book. Ambushes happened. Pilots made mistakes. They got bounced by Zeros hiding in the clouds. In those moments, they didn't have the luxury of choosing the engagement. They had to fight for their lives, and their planes were letting them down. McKenna knew something had to be done. The engineers wouldn't listen, the brass wouldn't listen, and pilots were dying. So he decided to take matters into his own hands. He was about to break every rule in the book, risking a court-martial and the end of his career. But in his mind, the choice was simple. He could follow the rules, or he could save lives. His idea was simple, almost laughably so. It was a stupid little trick born from a mechanic's intuition. He needed to eliminate that 3/8 of an inch of slack. He needed to make the controls instant, responsive, and deadly. He found his solution not in an aircraft parts catalogue, but in a supply depot, in a material that had no business being on a frontline fighter plane, piano wire. A simple 6-inch piece of high-tensile steel wire. It was unauthorized. It was unorthodox. And it was about to change the course of the air war in the Pacific. Working in secret, often under the cover of darkness, McKenna began modifying the planes. He would go into the cockpit of a P-38, his tools muffled by rags. He'd access the control column, the heart of the pilot's connection to his aircraft. There, deep within the complex machinery, he would find the aileron control cables. He'd carefully attach his 6-inch piece of piano wire, creating a direct, solid link that bypassed the built-in slack. The official system had springs designed to absorb shocks, but they also created that deadly delay. McKenna's fix was crude but effective. He was essentially hardwiring the pilot directly to the control surfaces. The first pilot to fly one of McKenna's modified Lightnings was a young lieutenant who had been complaining bitterly about the plane's sluggishness. He took off, climbed to altitude, and put the plane through its paces. When he landed, he sprinted over to McKenna, his face alight with excitement. "What did you do?" he yelled over the engine noise. "It's a different airplane. It turns on a dime." The word spread like wildfire through the squadron. Pilots started seeking McKenna out, begging him to work his magic on their planes. They called it the McKenna modification. Soon, he was working on every P-38 he could get his hands on. It was a risky game. If an officer discovered his unauthorized work, he'd be in serious trouble. He was altering a multi-million-dollar piece of military hardware based on his own gut feeling. But the results were undeniable. P-38s that once struggled to survive were now dominating the skies. Pilots who used to dread tangling with Zeros were now actively hunting them, confident that their planes could match the enemy's agility. They could finally get inside a Zero's turning circle. They could snap roll and evade with an immediacy they'd only dreamed of. The change in kill ratios was dramatic. Squadrons that had been suffering heavy losses were now scoring victory after victory. One of the most famous aces to benefit from this was Richard Bung, America's ace of aces. Bung flew a P-38 named Marge and was known for his incredible marksmanship and aggressive tactics. With McKenna's modification, Bung's P-38 became an extension of his own will, allowing him to rack up an astonishing 40 aerial victories. He and other top aces like Thomas Maguire, who scored 38 kills, were flying planes secretly tuned by Sergeant McKenna. They were a deadly combination. The skill of America's best pilots paired with a machine that was finally unlocked to its full potential. The Japanese pilots were baffled. The clumsy P-38s they had once toyed with were suddenly fighting like entirely different aircraft. They were faster, they could outclimb, and now, impossibly, they could outturn a Zero. The balance of power in the skies over New Guinea had shifted, all thanks to a stubborn mechanic and a piece of wire. Of course, a secret that big couldn't stay a secret forever. Eventually, the top brass noticed the incredible improvement in the P-38's performance. High-ranking engineering officers and representatives from Lockheed, the plane's manufacturer, were sent to investigate. They were determined to find out what was going on. When they finally cornered McKenna, he confessed everything. He showed them the piano wire, explained his reasoning, and braced for the consequences. He expected to be reprimanded, demoted, maybe even imprisoned. Instead, the Lockheed engineers were stunned. They examined his modification, tested the planes, and realized he had solved a problem their entire design team had missed. The acceptable tolerance wasn't acceptable at all in combat. McKenna's simple, direct fix was a stroke of genius. Far from being punished, his modification was studied, refined, and eventually incorporated into the manufacturing process for all new P-38s. The McKenna modification became standard issue. In total, it estimated that James McKenna's simple wire trick saved the lives of between 80 and 100 American pilots. These were men who came home because their planes responded when they needed them to. Men who survived impossible dogfights. Men who went on to have families and live full lives. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest innovations don't come from a boardroom or a design lab. They come from the people on the front lines, the ones who see the problem firsthand and have the courage and ingenuity to fix it, even if it means breaking the rules. James McKenna wasn't a pilot. He never scored a single aerial victory, but his contribution to the war effort was immeasurable. He was a hero in his own right, a quiet, unassuming mechanic who used his hands and his wits to turn the tide of the air war. His story is a testament to the power of practical knowledge and the courage to challenge the status quo. It's a forgotten chapter of World War II, a tale of how one man, a 6-inch piece of piano wire, and a whole lot of guts made the mighty P-38 Lightning truly invincible.
August 17, 1943. Dobodura Airfield, New Guinea. Technical Sergeant James McKenna, an aircraft mechanic with the 5th Air Force, watched another P-38 pilot prepare for a mission. McKenna wasn't just fixing planes. He was watching men fly to their potential deaths. He knew the P-38 Lightning was a beast of an aircraft, fast, powerful, and armed to the teeth. But it had a fatal flaw, a secret weakness that Japanese Zero pilots were exploiting with deadly precision. The P-38 couldn't turn with a Zero, and McKenna knew why. It was a problem of slack, the complex system of pulleys and cables that connected the pilot's control stick to the ailerons. There was a tiny, almost imperceptible delay, a 3/8 of an inch gap. When a pilot slammed his stick to the side, desperate to outturn a Zero, there was a split-second hesitation before the plane responded. In the lethal ballet of a dogfight, a split second was an eternity. That tiny delay was killing American pilots. McKenna had seen the after-action reports. He had listened to the debriefs from the pilots who made it back, their voices trembling with frustration. He had measured the slack himself countless times. Every engineering officer, every training manual, insisted the cable tension was within specifications. They called it acceptable tolerance. But what was acceptable in a hangar in Ohio was a death sentence over the skies of the Pacific. To the pilots, it was a terrifying lag. To McKenna, it was an engineering problem that demanded a solution, an unofficial one if necessary. The top brass wasn't listening. They were sticking to the book. But the book was getting pilots killed. So, McKenna decided to write his own chapter. He thought about the problem day and night. How do you eliminate slack in a control system that was, by all official accounts, perfectly fine? He couldn't just tighten the cables beyond their specified limits. That could risk snapping them under the extreme stress of combat maneuvers. The solution had to be simple, something that could be done quickly and without alerting the higher-ups who would surely put a stop to his unauthorized modifications. He needed something elegant, something that would work seamlessly without redesigning the entire system. And then it hit him. The answer wasn't in an aircraft parts catalog. It was in a music store. Piano wire, The idea was almost laughably simple. A short, 6-inch piece of high-tensile steel piano wire. McKenna devised a method to attach this wire to the aileron's control quadrant, essentially creating a preloaded spring system. The wire would take up that 3/8 of an inch of slack, keeping the entire system taut and responsive. When the pilot moved the stick, the response would be instantaneous. There would be no more delay, no more hesitation. The P-38 would finally be able to react as quickly as the pilot's own reflexes. It was a maverick solution born out of desperation and a deep sense of duty to the men who flew the planes he serviced. He knew he was taking a massive risk. This was an unauthorized modification to a critical flight system. If anything went wrong, if a plane crashed because of his wire trick, he would face a court-martial. His career would be over. He could go to prison. The engineering officers had already dismissed his concerns. They called him a grease monkey, meddling in things he didn't understand. They told him to stick to changing tires and patching holes. But McKenna understood something they didn't. He understood the cost of that acceptable tolerance. He saw it in the empty bunks and the somber faces of the surviving pilots. So, under the cover of the tropical night, McKenna began his secret project. He started with the plane of a pilot he trusted, a friend who knew the P-38's handling issues firsthand. With careful, practiced hands, he installed the first wire. It was a small piece of metal, barely noticeable to an untrained eye, but McKenna knew it could change everything. The next morning, that pilot took off on a combat patrol. McKenna waited, his stomach in knots. The hours crawled by. Was his fix a stroke of genius or a fatal mistake? Had he just signed his friend's death warrant? When the P-38 returned, the pilot taxied straight to McKenna's maintenance bay. He shut down the engines, climbed out of the cockpit, and walked over to McKenna with a look of pure astonishment. "What did you do to my plane?" he asked, not with anger, but with awe. "I've never felt anything like it. It handles like a dream. It's instant. A coup turn inside a zero today." The pilot went on to describe how he had engaged a Japanese fighter and, for the first time, was able to match its agility, to anticipate and counter its moves, to get on its tail and stay there. He had won. He had survived, because of a 6-inch piece of wire. Word spread like wildfire among the pilots. One by one, they started coming to McKenna, quietly, away from the prying eyes of the squadron officers. "Can you do that wire trick for my plane?" they'd ask. And McKenna, working tirelessly, obliged every single one. He created a production line of sorts, installing the unauthorized modification in dozens of P-38s. He called it the McKenna clutch. The pilots just called it a lifesaver. The difference was immediate and dramatic. The kill-to-loss ratio of the squadron began to climb. P-38 pilots were not just surviving encounters with zeros, they were dominating them. The change was so significant that it couldn't stay a secret for long. The squadron's commanding officer, a man who had previously ignored McKenna's concerns, noticed the sudden spike in performance. He knew his pilots hadn't suddenly become better overnight. Something else was at play. He confronted the pilots, who finally confessed about McKenna's secret modification. The CO went to find McKenna, not to reprimand him, but to understand. He had him demonstrate the fix. He saw the logic, the simple genius of it. Instead of a court-martial, McKenna got a promotion and an order. Install the wire fix on every P-38 in the 5th Air Force. The official request went up the chain of command, all the way to Wright Field in Ohio, the heart of Army Air Force's engineering. They analyzed McKenna's simple wire trick and, faced with the undeniable combat results, had to admit he was right. The acceptable tolerance was, in fact, a deadly flaw. They developed an official kit based directly on McKenna's design, to be installed on every P-38 Lightning in the Pacific Theater. A technical order was issued. Sargent's renegade fix became standard procedure. Historians estimate that this single, simple innovation saved the lives of between 80 and 100 American pilots. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest innovations don't come from boardrooms or engineering labs. They come from the people on the ground, the ones with grease under their fingernails, who see the problem up close. James McKenna wasn't an officer or a highly educated engineer. He was a mechanic who refused to accept the status quo when he knew lives were on the line. He saw a problem, defied orders to fix it, and in doing so, changed the course of the air war in the Pacific. His story is a testament to ingenuity, courage, and the profound impact one person can have when they refuse to believe that something is good enough.